Here we are at the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame. For the purposes of documentation, Rigoberto, please state your name, where you were born, and where you had your childhood, and then we'll launch into the first question.
Thank you for having me. My name is Rigoberto González. I was born in Bakersfield, California in 1970 to a family of migrant farm workers. They were grape pickers. So at the age of 2, after my brother was born in 1972, my family decided to return to their homeland, which became my homeland, and that's Michoacan in southern Mexico. And we stayed there until 1980. And in 1980, we came back to Southern California, to the small town of Thermo in the Coachella Valley, which is also a farm working landscape, and where I eventually joined my family as a farm worker.
So you were approximately 10 years old when you came back.
Yes.
You recently published a really interesting article in the Los Angeles Times, and you were talking about your childhood relationship with books.
Mm-hmm.
For our viewers, could you give us a succinct, tell us the role that books played in your childhood?
Mm-hmm. Besides being farm workers, my family suffered from illiteracy. My grandparents did not read or write. My parents did not read or write, or very limited. The only thing they knew how to write was your names, because that's what you signed your paychecks. They had these signatures, which I could actually forge, and I forged most of my life when I was a teenager. So did my brother, because they were so easy to forge, these signatures. Anyway, I learned very early on that my responsibility as the oldest in this little group was to learn English as soon as possible, because I was going to be a translator. I was going to be the person that was going to bridge my family's literacy to this world that we had entered, where sometimes we did get so many things in print that needed to be translated. And I took to it very quickly. There was always something about the challenge of learning language that I loved, but also the world of books that I appreciated, because it was the only time that I was left alone. This was a household with 19 people. And I remember that anytime I sat with a book, I was left alone. So
do you remember any particular title that stands out in your memory? Any particular novel, collection of stories? Or
the only access I had to books that I could own was at the local Goodwill store, the secondhand store. These were all mass paperbacks. So I would read Robin Cook, Peter Benchley, not Stephen King yet, but eventually did, and murder mysteries.
And you were reading genre fiction?
Genre fiction, and that was it. It wasn't until the Bookmobile guy introduced me to other kinds of literature. The first book that he introduced me to was The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And then eventually Truman Capote.
Talk a little bit about what Truman Capote meant to you when you encountered him.
Truman Capote, the first time I saw Truman Capote was actually in a film, and I thought he was an actor. And this was Murder by Death, which is the Neil Simon play. It was the spoof of murder mystery characters, which is why I was drawn to it, because I love murder mysteries. I saw Truman Capote, and immediately I recognized this man is gay. I was struggling with my own sexuality. So I saw this character on screen, and I'm like, okay, who is this Truman Capote? And by coincidence, maybe it was within a couple of weeks of me seeing this film in late night television, that he passed away. As the announcer, the famed, celebrated author Truman Capote. I go, wait, Truman Capote is an author? And it was I remember the next time the Bookmobile came, I asked the Bookmobile librarian, do you have any books by that actor, Truman Capote? He's not really an actor. He was just, because that was the only time that Truman Capote appeared in film.
So we're talking your what?
I can't remember when Truman Capote died. It was 1980.
Maybe?
It was earlier. Truman Capote died in 1980 something.
Okay.
I remember. So I was like the
So you were in adolescence when you encountered him.
Yeah. And he introduced me to Breakfast at Tiffany's, which is the first book. And I identified with Lola May from Tulip, Texas, because she redefined, she reimagined herself, right? Something that I yearned to do myself. Even though I always tell this joke that I never got the Tiffany's. I never saw Tiffany in the book. Where's Tiffany? It was Tiffany. I never understood until later when I saw the film. Tiffany's was the jewelry store.
So it sounds like Truman Capote was a seminal author in your adolescence.
Oh, yeah.
So how do we transition to that? When did you become aware of Latino authors? And this might be a case for you to talk about, because I know that you've spoken about this in the past. So this is maybe my way of saying, I'm going to take a guess, Tomas Rivera.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about Tomas Rivera, and if in fact he was maybe the first Latino author who opened another world.
Further on Truman Capote, the other book that was really important was A Christmas Memory. And it was autobiographical, and it was a child character. The child character who was an outsider among a group of outsiders identified with that. That's what carried me forward to college when I began to encounter Latino writers. I went to UC Riverside. This is in 1988.
Okay.
And I remember I was touring the campus and I saw the Tomás Rivera Library. So I was like, who is this Tomás Rivera? That he must be an important figure that warrants a building named after him. And I found out very quickly what his prominence was. He was the chancellor of the university and also the author of, Letras Latinas. So immediately I had to find this book because I was curious. And when I did, another door opened up because unlike the literature I had been reading, I had never seen myself or even people of color in a lot of these books. There were peripheral characters, there were marginal characters. But here's Tomás Rivera writing about us as a center of a narrative. And from there, I began to go to the bookshelf in the Latino studies or Chicano studies courses, and I just began to consume. So after Tomás Rivera came Oran Arias, the Tomás Unchale, the Fanaya, of course, Ves Mi Última, Sandra Cisneros, The House on Mango Street. So
Did that coincide with you taking your first creative writing workshop as an undergrad?
yes, it did. I was a part of the honors program. So I was able to select whatever certain courses had an honor component. And out of curiosity, I'd never really thought about being a writer. That came later. In the beginning, I'd only written like one poem, and all high school seniors were all forced to write a poem. And I wrote one poem and I won second or third prize. I thought, I can take this creative writing class. I'm an award-winning poet. I took this class and immediately I recognized, even though I couldn't articulate it very clearly, that I had something different. I didn't know what that was yet, but it maybe was the fact that I was writing about different things or that what I wrote had a different sensibility than what others were writing.
So this is as an undergrad at UC.
As an undergrad, I was a freshman or senior.
Do you remember who your instructor was?
Yeah, Judy Kronerfeld was my instructor. Eventually, Ada Schmidt, Susan Strait, all these.
If you had to single out a mentor during your undergraduate years at UC Riverside, who might that be?
Susan Strait and Moria Simon were both great because I was writing both fiction and nonfiction.
As an undergrad?
Yes. That's what I thought a writer was. You wrote everything. And they gave me that opportunity. I didn't realize that you had to choose. It wasn't until I went to UC Davis that I got tracked because I got into both programs, but they said your thesis has to be one
or the other.
Which is why I went to Arizona State to do a second MFA.
Backing up, but I want to ask you about that decision because it's a decision that a lot of writers today have to encounter. Do I do graduate work in creative writing or not?
Right.
How did you come to the decision to pursue a graduate degree in creative writing,
which
resulted in UC Davis?
As an undergraduate, my fantasy of being a writer just meant that I was going to write, not that I was going to have a profession. Up until college, I thought that a writer was a person who was dead because all the books that I read and the literature that I was exposed to, the authors, in my textbooks, the authors had a birth date and a death date. So I thought, that's what a book is, written by someone who's dead. I had no idea they were alive. I never researched them. No internet, so don't judge. Anyway, no Wikipedia. It wasn't until I actually saw a writer in front of me, and her name was Yolanda Barnes. And she read a story, and I sat there floored. I was like, wait a minute, you wrote that story? Like, wait, so you can write the story and go up in front of people and read your story? It's a whole new world. I love UC Riverside for that. Even if I didn't intend to, it really was a place where so many doors and discoveries were made for me. I didn't even major in creative writing. I majored in humanities. And my teachers were like, you should really think about going to a writing program. And I thought, what for? What do you do? Take more classes and then do what? So there's so many things you can do. I said, I want to be a teacher because that's the job that I understood. I said, well, you could be a creative writing teacher. Oh, okay, great, fantastic. So that's why I took that leap.
And how did you UC Davis?
I was still close to home. I didn't want to venture outside of California. That's why I chose Riverside. It was only 80 miles away from home, even though I didn't go back as often eventually. At the beginning, I still needed that proximity because I was the first one to venture out of the house. Nobody had done that in my family, not by himself. Usually we always go in a group. And I remember the few times that I would even go down to Mexico by myself, I would arrive and people were like, what's happened? Are you angry? Nobody could understand why traveling by yourself was just not a concept in my family. I applied to UC Irvine and they didn't accept it. But UC Davis turned out to be a gift because Sandra McPherson, that's the person. I remember I visited UC Davis. I visited class and I realized I have to be here. I have to come here.
She made an impact on you the first time you encountered her.
Yeah, I just love the way she talked about writing. She was actually talking about one of her own poems. And I was blown away by how much she cared about writing and how easy she was to understand.
Mhm.
I encountered that at East Riverside as well.
Yeah.
But I wanted more of that. That's the kind of teaching that I wanted. She made me feel really comfortable.
It wasn't a case of you having researched her. You encountered her.
Yeah.
Okay.
Moira Simon gave me a book by Sandy Streamers.
Okay. So you had read
Yeah.
some of her work.
Yeah. But when she found out I got into UC Davis, she says, "Oh, you didn't kind of read Streamers." And I thought, that's it. I made the right decision. I need to go to UC Davis.
The happy coincidence of having Francisco Alarcón there was just bonus.
I remember on a bench with a couple of friends of mine outside of Sproul Hall, all of a sudden Francisco goes by. I had never seen Francisco, never met him, but the person I was with recognized him and says, "You know what that is? That's Francisco Alarcón. He's a Chicano writer, and he's gay." Immediately, I'm like, I got to find out who Francisco Alarcón is. And he had just been hired in 1982, the year that I also started the program.
Mhm.
From the minute I began reading his work, I went to one of his readings and I took a couple of classes. I said, you know what? He's got to be on my thesis. When I introduced Francisco to the creative writing program, and they just loved him. Immediately, they're like, invite him to go to the Art of the Wild. Francisco was very grateful. Since then, we stayed in touch off and on until his death.
So it sounds like UC Davis was a good choice because of Sonia McPherson
Yeah,
or Francisco Alarcón.
and Clarence Major.
I want to use Francisco because I know that you've written elsewhere that he became a model on what mentoring can look like. I know mentoring is something you take very seriously. So I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit about how mentoring has played a role in your life, how it's evolved through your trajectory. First, you being mentored, and then you getting to a stage where you get back and mentor. Just talk a little bit about it.
A couple of things that Francisco did that was beyond the classroom. That's what I understood mentoring was. Mentoring was not only when you stand up in front of the classroom and deliver any kind of wisdom or knowledge to the students, but what you do beyond that, which is you don't get compensated for it. You know, the goodness of your heart or a sense of responsibility. Francisco would do so much. He would have a couple of us literature class. He asked, does anybody here write poetry? People raise their hands. So we're going to have a little workshop. And once every other week or so, we get together and share our poems and talk about them. He took us to the radio station to read our poetry. I wrote about that story, how we all dressed up. And you guys are on radio, not television. Well, we were out laughing. But anyway, we had a great time there. And he took us to the Young Museum to see the huge Aztec exhibit.
So he was a field trip.
Yeah, and he was he was an advisor in the project. And I remember that he said he ran a bus. I said, just give me $10. And I accept checks for the rental of the bus. I think I was the only one that showed up with $10. But he took it like, wow, somebody actually paid attention. Give me $10. And he took the check. I don't even know if he cashed it. That was the things that he did. I always felt that this is part of the nurturing. Later on, I realized how much of a gift that was because it takes time. You have to compromise and sacrifice your own energies elsewhere. So then at the end, I appreciate even more in that way. But he was the more active, I think, of my professors.
The other thing, I was recently reading a draft of your essay on Francisco that's forthcoming in your book. I was struck by how you mentioned the other gift he gave you was by being a role model and embodying these two identities,
Yes.
being Chicano and being gay.
Absolutely.
And unpack that.
Because as an undergraduate, there was a Chicano identity thriving in that group, but I never felt that I belonged. One, because I felt very Mexican. A lot of the Chicanos came from urban spaces. And there was also an element of homophobia that was there. And people would whisper, oh, it's also I'm gay. And I'm like, well, I'm gay. So I was very closeted when I was an undergraduate.
Yeah.
And so there was all these reasons why I didn't really embrace being a Chicano. It wasn't until I took Alarcon's class. He was very patient with me because I said a couple of things that I didn't think were necessarily adding to the conversation. I was just being very closed-minded and rejecting. I said, I can't be a Chicano. But then when I learned more about Francisco's trajectory, his life, he also was raised in Mexico and he was able to embrace Chicano and he was gay. So I began to say, how does that work? And then I recognized that's where everything was. There was no demarcation. Everything was layered and woven into. And that's who Francisco was. He was a gay man. He was a Chicano. He was a Mexican. It can be all these things. He was an example of that. He was really the first one that I encountered in that way, even though I had read a couple of other gay Chicano writers, but they were fiction writers. Francisco showed me that it was possible. And then I very slowly embraced being a Chicano.
And so then when your time at Davis was winding down, I imagine you had to decide, now what? How did the decision come about to do the MFA?
Because I had been tracked into poetry. And I did a poetry thesis because of Francisco. I wanted him to be part of that. I thought I still feel like I need to develop my fiction skills And so I decided, I'm going to do another, but I got in as a poet and then I switched over. And that was always a strategy. So that, because I knew Roberto Rios was down there, I thought maybe he'll help me out. And he didn't. And yeah, it worked out. I went, because Davis was an MA, and then I thought this is different anymore, but I didn't understand it. That
Yeah.
there was an MA and then an MFA. So I did my MFA. As soon as I got Arizona, I said, I want to do fiction.
And they were okay with that.
They just said, give us some examples of your work and we'll have Ron Carlson and Melissa Pritchard look it over. That's it.
Was your publication in the Chicano chapbook series while you were at ASU, after you were at ASU?
Yeah, they came out right after even my first book of Gary Soto had already accepted the chapbook and he was working on it when the book got accepted. But the book came out first.
Okay.
But he accepted the poems before that. He just took so long.
We'll postpone. I just wanted to frame where that was. We're going to come back to that in a moment. But I want to stick to ASU because I think ASU is a good way to talk about one of the topics that I want to talk about. And that is, let me just preface this by saying that I sometimes get a sense that the history of the arts and the history of literature is also, in some regards, history of friendships, history of collaborations. And I know that at ASU, if I remember correctly, you encountered Richard Yanez. Tell me about your take on this whole phenomena of literary friendships as a way of talking about meeting those two writers and the role they've played in your life.
We're always looking for community. When I was at Davis, I gravitated toward the LGBT groups. And when I was in Arizona, I used the term Hispanic, even though I prefer Chicano or Latino, but I needed community. I believe I was the only Latino writer. And the joke was that they would bring somebody else to replace someone else going to leave. So Richard was that person. I met Richard when he was actually coming to check out the program. I was already in my last year, so we were not going to cross over. He came to my apartment. A friend of mine who was hosting him, all his boss was Filipino, brought him down and said, you got to meet Rico. He came over to my apartment. And I was blown away that we had read all the same authors. It was immediate friendship because we had read the same books. We were passionate about, we were both very feminists. We were both very much invested in community. And I just thought, okay, this is like my kindred spirit here. Yeah. We stayed in touch the whole time. He through his whole education in Arizona. And while I was traveling around, moving to other places, we stayed in touch. I also met, I didn't meet him actually, or no, I did meet him. It was the last year I was at Arizona because Eduardo was an undergraduate and Roberto Rios was like, oh, you got to meet. And Eduardo resisted it for a long time. And finally he calls me. But he calls me the week I'm moving out. But we managed to get together. I met his sister and we had a wonderful conversation. It was very similar. These are people that had read the same books, were passionate about the same things. And immediately he became almost like my little brother. And we've maintained those friendships. But I think it's the fact that you want somebody like you. I've always yearned for somebody in my family to acknowledge my complete identity, not only as a person, but as a professional. And it's hard to pull off with family because they don't understand. So meeting Richard and meeting Francisco were ways to, Eduardo, and you eventually, of course, were to feel like these are members of my family besides being members of my tribe.
I do know, I'm going to insist a little bit about how I read somewhere recently, and I was very touched by it. Those of us who know you assume that Eduardo's probably your closest friend.
Yeah.
But I read it in print recently. I forget what interview it was. You said, oh, Eduardo Corral is my best friend. I thought that was a very interesting little pivot by taking something that some people can consider private. More than anything, I'm curious about the fact that you, in an interview, got into print. Talk a little bit about that. No, not by, no, but the step of actually saying, oh yeah, I want the world to know that Eduardo Corral is my best friend.
I think the reason I say him my best friend, because I talk to him on the phone almost every day. I talk to my brother once a week, but I talk to Eduardo once, sometimes twice a day. We communicate constantly, phone, text message, and Twitter. He's the only one that knows everything. Absolutely. There's always has to be one person. He was very helpful. Like when I was sick, when I was suffering from the MS, and he was very helpful to me. He'd go to AJP and he was there for me when I sometimes had to go to the doctor. He's the only one.
It's like his family.
And I always tell him that I adopted his family because I know his parents and I speak to his mother on the phone every once in a while. There's ways in which and the reason I came out with that was the vein of that conversation I was having with this interviewer was about the misperceptions that people have about writers and personas that we create. And I think with me, I don't know how other people see me, but I get these sort of conflicting reports. And I think people sometimes don't understand the long, arduous, laborious journey that it took for me to get to where I am now. And this is not only including my healthcare, but also the times where I didn't have money or couldn't
Well,
get published.
you just reminded me of something. I'm going to ask you, see if you can
Mhm.
talk. I know at one point you had mentioned, this is a little bit for the archive.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, there was a moment where you actually enrolled to do a
Oh,
PhD
yeah.
program at New
Absolutely.
Mexico. Tell us about that. What happened there?
My family all returned back to Mexico in 1982 when I was at Davis.
Mhm.
So another reason why I went to the MFA program at Arizona was to stay here. I had no idea what else going to do. After finishing the Arizona State program, I had met Rodolfo Anaya,
Mhm.
but he had already retired. When I visited Albuquerque, I just thought, oh my God, this is a beautiful place. It's a beautiful landscape, a beautiful city. I would love to come here, but I needed some kind of a way to get there, right? And so I thought, why don't I just do a PhD program and see what happens? So I applied for it. I got in and I was excited about it, but I knew very quickly that I had made a mistake, not moving there, but doing a PhD program because
Yeah, what did you discover about yourself?
when I spent 5 days out of the week writing poetry and 2 days doing research, very clear that I wasn't there for. So I dropped out. I felt really bad because I took out a loan and I dropped out. That's when I worked I had a background in dance.
Okay.
So I worked at a couple of dance studios. I worked at a folklorico and a flamenco dance studio.
It sounds like what you're saying is that the experience of being in a PhD program, you discovered that perhaps you weren't drawn to a certain kind of academic writing and research. And yet you've gone on to be a very prolific book
Yeah.
reviewer
Yeah.
and critic. So what was it about that kind of writing that just didn't engage you?
I don't think it was the writing. I think it was just the community itself. I felt enriched and stimulated intellectually when I talked to writers. I was a scholar. No offense to scholars,
Yeah.
but they just were not doing it for me. And our interests are very different. Our vocabulary is very different.
Yeah.
I thought, I really don't want to hang out with these folks. They're good people, but they're not doing anything for me as a writer. I just didn't feel as an artist.
Let's pivot now to the inevitable topic of publishing and publications. I alluded a little bit earlier to your Chicano chapbook series contribution to Gary Soto.
Yeah.
Tell that story, your relationship with Gary Soto, how that came to be, and also looking back on your publishing trajectory, what that publication meant or means to you, being in that series.
The Chicano chapbook series circulated among many of us who were in the know about that particular project Gary Soto had. He had done one early manifestation that he resurrected with these new voices. So many of these people went on to have careers. So he really did have a kind of sense of talent. Gary, he was my teacher at UC Riverside for one semester. He was a guest. We didn't really have a good relationship. I'll say that. Yeah. His teaching wasn't what I needed. He was important to me.
Yeah.
They were important to me on the page, but as teachers, not really. So I decided one way to find, because I was not getting published in magazines. I was getting turned down. Nobody would publish my work. I knew it wasn't because it wasn't any good. I knew that. And I had that kind of confidence. I knew that I was just too foreign in some ways. And I thought, that's okay. I'll find my way elsewhere. So one opportunity was a Chicano chapbook series. I thought, that's going to be cool. So I sent it to him and he didn't remember me at all. He said, I don't remember you as my student, but maybe that's a good thing. So we'll just leave it at that. And he has a really strange sense of humor, right? And then all of a sudden I got the book picked up because I submitted the manuscript to a contest in the National Board Series. And I told Gary Soto, I said, hey, listen, my book is actually coming out. And he says, oh, great. Do you still want to do the chapbook? And I said, because that'll be a nice feather in my cap. That'll be one more person that I know. He invited me to read with him at the University of Arizona in Tucson.
After your book came out.
After the book came out. I remember that was one of the questions that somebody in the audience posed because it was a established writer had to choose an up and coming, right? And he chose me. And somebody asked him, what did you choose Rigoberto? He says, oh, because he's a new book coming out and I read his work for the Chicano chapbook series and I loved the book. And so I thought, why not? I wanted to meet him. I would hang out with him a little bit. And I did. Every once in a blue moon, he would come to New York and I would meet him for a beer. And he always sends me, every time he publishes a little postcard, I don't know if he's ever communicated with you, but he types everything on a typewriter.
Written.
That's what he does. That's the only way he does it. He types in and he'll send it to me and he'll say something very self-effacing. Hey, Rigoberto, how are you? And when new book came out, if you read it, you'll be maybe the third person. Nobody reads my books anymore, that kind of stuff.
So you made your debut with a national poetry series. Talk a little bit about, because I think the dilemma that some writers face is, do I try and win a book contest, a national book contest, or do I try to find a press, a micro press that I feel an affinity with and publish in that way? Looking back at the span of your career and at publishing in general, What are your views about this question of when it comes time to get your work out in the world? National book contest or go with the micro press, who you think is cool and start there? What do you think about that?
I give very different advice to my students now that I took myself when I was very young. Part of the reason is I had no idea. When I was starting out, I tried the small book contests or even small presses, got no bites. I tried for a couple of years. I finished the manuscript in 2004. That was
Mhm.
my thesis from UC Davis.
Mhm.
Every year after that, I tried to send it out for 5 years. I tried to send it out to small contests I never heard of, to big contests at that, try to be ambitious. I cast a net, nothing until the National Poetry Series. Now I tell my students there's advantages and disadvantages. With small press, the disadvantage is distribution. Sometimes people have prejudices against small presses.
Yeah.
With the larger presses, it's a bigger door, but you still have to do a lot of the work. So they're not the answer to your prayers.
Yeah.
A beginning, right? And sometimes the big presses don't give you a say
Mm.
about certain things. Like they won't give you a say, not that it matters, but a book cover, for example, or they
Yeah.
won't give you a say of maybe the font, or they have a certain way negotiating publicity and things like that. And you're not part of the community in that way, which sometimes may be something you want.
Depends on your aims. Whereas with the small press,
Be part of the whole process.
it's more of a
Collaborative.
which may be part of the enjoyment of publishing.
Exactly. You learn a lot.
Yeah.
You learn a lot from that.
There's another chapbook that we haven't spoken about. It's called Skins Preserve Us.
Oh, yeah.
How did that one come about?
That one came out from one of my old chums from UC Davis, Charlie McDonald. He started a journal they're called The Mockingbird Review, and he published one of my poems. I think it was one of my first publications. He had a reading at one of the bars, and then he eventually said, "Hey, Rigo, listen, once in a while we have these small presses have these chapbooks, and I thought it'd be cool if I did one of yours." And then I was working, it was like the 2001, because I remember the guy that did the cover image
Yeah.
was one of my colleague. I was working at an after school program as a literacy teacher and the art teacher. And I said, "Hey, listen, what if I pay you to do a little thing? Here's what I envision, some bones." And then he did the lettering and bones, and it was beautiful. I was so talented. And he was all happy that he had gotten this opportunity. So that worked out.
So you actually had the experience of what
Yeah.
you were talking about earlier, being part of the process, and it wasn't
Exactly.
satisfying.
So it's not a mystery anymore when I learn about the process and the stages and the patience that it takes
Mhm.
to be part of that. Nothing is rushed and you understand why. When things go slowly, there's a number of reasons why that's happening. It's like you don't have to make things up.
You have been successful in multiple genres. Could you talk a little bit about how your process is, compare and contrast, for example, writing a memoir versus writing a collection of poems, writing a collection of critical
Yeah.
prose versus writing a novel, collection of short fiction? Talk a little bit about that.
I think in the beginning, I was a little more strategic and a little more deliberate in what I set out to do. I'm now 19 books in. So now it's very much internalized
Mhm.
now from the get go. When I'm imagining a project, I understand, okay, that's a memoir, that's a book of poetry, that's a book of fiction or nonfiction. But in the beginning, I wasn't. Very few times that I'd start something and say, "Oh, wait, that's not a poem, that's actually an essay, or that's not a story." Developing this skill meant a lot of sitting down, imagining the journey of the process,
Mhm.
and sometimes failing. In fact, most times failing. It didn't work,
Mhm.
and that's fine. For everything that I do write, there's so much that gets thrown away.
Yeah.
People think I publish everything I write. No, I write plenty, but plenty gets out in print, but plenty does not. No, I'm not there.
Talk a little bit about the process, the germination of, say, Butterfly Boy.
Butterfly Boy I think was a very different journey because there was no nonfiction classes being taught anywhere. I knew there was one in Davis, there was one young woman doing nonfiction, but everybody scoffed at it because they thought she's 22. The reason I wanted to write nonfiction was because I felt my family was deliberately forgetting some things. And I also thought that, and they wanted to forget because there was a lot of pain, a lot of hurt coming over as undocumented. These are not good memories. Why do they want to hold on to them? Right?
Yeah.
But there was a new generation of children being born that didn't know that. And I wanted them to understand that our family went through a lot to get to the moment of privilege that they have. I didn't want it to be like, "Oh yeah, we're born here in the United States and we always had a home and we also have food on the table." I thought there's a danger in not knowing that your family sacrificed so much and that food on the table took a lot of work, that it wasn't just, there it is, it was magic. No, they weren't. I felt I needed to write the reality of their experiences. Not that this was going to be a definitive biography of my family, but I just wanted it to be documented so I don't forget them.
So so it sounds like it came from a very personal reason, and then eventually it found its way into a publisher. But what about the projects Crossing Vines and Men Without Bliss, which are your two adult fiction?
Crossing Vines was my thesis at Arizona State.
Okay.
So I developed that. And of course, what was I going to write about? I was going to write about the migrant farm workers. It was interesting because a couple of my uncles read that book. I remember one of my uncles telling me, I liked it, but there's too much sex. I'm like, that's, I like they're in the field most of the time, not like in the field. And my brother read it and he had a fun time with it because he recognized some of the figures and these are composites of people they encounter in the fields, or little anecdotes and little stories that I wove into the narrative. But in Crossing Vines, I wanted to continue writing nonfiction.
If I say Men Without Bliss.
Men Without Bliss, because at Arizona State, I wrote stories. I worked on stories. And so I thought, let me just go ahead and continue building these stories. And Oklahoma was a great place to do that because they had this series. I loved the lineage of that series. And same thing with Butterfly Boy. When I looked for a publisher, I knew that Jaime Manrique had published a book, Eminem Maricones, a book that I loved. And he was really happy with them. So I said, you know what? I'm going to go ahead. And people ask me sometimes why I continue to go with small presses or university presses and why I don't make the leap to the big presses. I get that a lot. At this point, my answer is very cynical and almost a little bit clapbacky. What are they going to do? Make my name more famous? Give me more money? What do we need? At this point, what for? I really don't understand what for, even though I've had people knocking on my door. But I'm very happy with the university presses. In the beginning, though, I feel like it's too late for me. I'm sure it's not, but I feel like I tried to do that for years when I first got to New York. I tried to knock on the door of all these big presses. Nobody opened the door. So now I'm like, now they're showing up after I did all the labor. You know what? Thank you. Go ahead and find somebody else. I'll do my thing. So even agents, they tell me I'm crazy. And I'm like, I'm making good money. It was not making good money out of me. You are. Big publishers was not making money out of me. You are. So I'm going to do this to make money for them. I'm not interested.
One area we haven't touched on is your children's books and your YA novels. Can you talk a little bit about those two strands of your work?
The children's book was actually Francisco who encouraged me. He said, try it. Children's Book Press. I do good work. You've got some stories in there. We used to do little exercises for him and writing exercises for his classes. He sat down with me one time and he said he had just published a couple of books with Children's Book Press. His journey was so easy because his verse really lent itself for its accessibility, but also the curiosity in his work. He said, try it. Everybody's in there. Juan Felipe Herrera's in there. Gloria Saldúa. Why not? We need Chicano writers. He was telling me that we need the next generation, Chicano writers to be in there, right? Because these were all established veteran writers. So I did, and I thought, well, what can be my contribution to this? Because I can't just be a story. It has to be something. Their books are speaking to a certain issue. Soledad Ice with the first one. I was working as a literacy specialist, and there's something that I experienced as a kid, being a latchkey kid. So the story is about being a latchkey kid, and I sent it to Children's Book Press. They immediately said, yes, we're going to work on it, but he's don't want to work. And that's when I really learned how hard it was to write a children's book. I did two, and I don't think I'm ever going to do another one. I've tried many times unsuccessfully. Those are the hardest books to write. They really are. They seem simple. It's what people think, oh, I can do that. It's not that simple.
What about the YA novel?
The YA novel.
You got three of them now, right?
Yeah, I get three. That also came from somebody, a publisher I met. Who at the time he was working for Allison Publications. And he said, we are just starving for YA literature with people of color. We would love if you would even try, or we could help you if you ever wanted to do the YA market, if we can write about young, gay, Latino characters or a story. And I was like, okay, thank you. But I thought of a market. I read some YA stuff. I wasn't interested too much in it. So I left it alone. But it wasn't until the murder of Lawrence King, who had revealed his crush on another young man in Oxnard, California. And then the young man came and shot him and killed him. And this was 2008. Because I remember thinking that 20 years after I graduated from high school, we're still afraid of the gay kid, right? And that inspired me to do something. I said, you want to go write YA books with these young gay Latino characters, but my angle is going to be a different complexity of experiences because I didn't want to write just tragic stories. Even though there's a tragedy in that book, in Mariposa Club, the other four characters have very just different relationships with their parents. Some of the parents are really supportive of their kids. Others are not. They're very afraid for their kids. That's why the four characters are important to their age. Even when I was writing it, my editor was telling me, think of it as a series. Don't just resolve everything in the first book.
Yeah.
And the first book is still the most successful one. I did the sequel because they were graduating from high school. So the plot is they're going to crash at the prom. One of them's going to have their trauma. Somebody was like, the third one, Bond, is called Mariposa U. And I thought, they didn't all go to the same college. So I got to follow the one character. Young adult readers were mad because they thought, where are the other characters? That we love them because it's the four of them and their banter and the way they talk. And it has to be the four of them. The other reason they didn't like it, the criticism for my first two YA books was that they were not having sex. Well, I don't want to write, I feel creepy. I'm a grown man. I don't want to write high school students having sex. It's not going to happen. But now that this kid in the third book, who was of age, he was 18, he's going to have his first sexual experience, and it wasn't very good. Kids don't like it. They're like, I can't believe he finally has sex and he hates it. No. It's a part of his journey.
So this feedback you're describing,
Yeah.
is letters you get?
There's a whole network out there. They have blogs and they have Tumblrs, and these are young people that consume YA literature. They're
Yeah.
teenagers, and they interact. I did so many interviews with them. They were the most probing, fascinating, and learned interviews I've ever done about the Mariposa Club. They're really serious about this.
Yeah.
They called me out on the first cover, in which I also didn't like. I complained too, because the four people on the cover did not reflect the identities of my young people. First of all, they didn't look Latino. And I said, can't you darken them a little? Because they're very white. That's who they are. And I describe a couple of them as being very dark. And one of them was overweight, and all these four young kids were very thin.
Yeah.
So they're like, who are these? These are not the characters in the book. And I said, you know what? Wasn't my choice. Later, when I reprinted this through Tincture Books, Steve Berman said to me, now that Allison went under, can I republish your books? I love your books. And I said, yes. And he did a couple of covers and they were better.
From all the different genres that you've published in, the YA genre has been the one that you've been most engaged with your audience.
Yeah, very much. Butterfly Boy, for years after Butterfly Boy, and now once in a while, because it's continued to be, I'm surprised. It's 10 years. And I just went to Delaware Community College where it was like the one book, one campus. So everybody had a copy of Butterfly Boy. So I'm surprised that it's still relevant and making waves, and is very important to groups that are discussing so many different topics about that particular book. But the first years after Butterfly Boy was published, I received at least one email a week by somebody telling me, that's my story. That's my brother. That's my cousin. That's my friend. That's my uncle. And that was pretty good, including a woman who was from the White House.
Really?
Yeah, I can't remember what her position was, some agriculture or something like that. And she said, that's my father. It's my father. Okay, interesting.
Did a book like Red Ink Retablos and the one that's forthcoming with Michigan is a very different process.
Those are nonfiction and collections of my speeches, book reviews, and critical essays that I do once in a while. I'm already envisioning the next book of speeches because Trump. Since the Trump win, I've become a motivational speaker. So now I'm like, because people are in this state of distress about their role as writers and artists. There's always this question of what do we do? How do we move through this? How do we navigate this era where so much of our energies are being consumed by rage?
So what, you've given some speeches
Since this election.
since November. You've been contacted by people saying, come speak to our group.
Yeah, companies still do, but then they tell me, can you motivate us? Because we're depressed. That kind of thing. And so I've begun to do that. And even the conference I just did in Albany was about that. They told me, could you say something? Because everybody's devastated, everybody's dejected.
So give us your message.
In one way, I feel that I need to remind people that we come from a very long line of activists and literary activists. And clearly people who were writing during even more troubled times. So imagine if those folks a couple of generations ago had frozen up the way that some of us want to freeze up now, what would we have denied ourselves and what would they have denied that community? So there really isn't an excuse. We should learn from that strength that this is a time to really write. This is a time to create. This is a time to push back without having what we create be defined by the administration that we're in. There's ways to do that.
So in your particular case, are you doing anything differently since this election?
My next
Okay.
book of poetry is definitely speaking to something wider, but now nothing can be seen outside of the political lens,
Yeah.
which frankly, many of us who are women writers, who are writers of color, who are LGBT writers, have always experienced. Our work can never be seen outside of a political lens,
Mhm.
right? It's not seen as inferior, right? The notion of political poetry, which was always scoffed at for many times, right? Because they thought political poetry is inferior, it's marginal, it's very regional, it's only speaking to a certain kind of audience or an occasion. Now it's like, how can anything be seen outside of the political lens?
Mhm.
So in many ways, the field is caught up to what many of us have been doing.
What would be your contribution to the debate? Maybe debate is not the right word. I'm thinking about the anthology that came out a couple of years ago, co-edited by Carmen Jimenez Smith
Mhm.
and John Chavez, called Angels of the Americlips,
Right.
multi-genre, which seems to be making the case that Latino letters aesthetically is becoming more diverse.
Yes.
It's being nourished by the more innovative experimental strands of poetry. I think I've heard you say that we've had writers in that strand all along,
Mhm.
like Juan Felipe Herrera. What's your take on that tendency of people who maybe don't feel like they want to write illicit political poetry, for lack of a better term?
Or
But
community or
yeah,
identity. You
yeah,
know what?
yeah.
The thing is that there's not just 4 chairs in the room. We have plenty of space, right? So as long as the conversation is about the making room for everybody, that everybody is part of the movement, that's fine. What I push back on is
Mhm.
when people tell me that identity politics is yesterday or write about community is passe.
Mhm.
That I really take issue with,
Yeah.
that kind of argument, because that doesn't necessarily mean a welcoming, community building language. I don't understand a lot of the avant-garde, experimental language poetry, but I don't think of it as lesser. I don't think of it as inferior. If anything, I challenge myself to try to learn. So I expect the same from that community.
Mhm.
And even this conversation makes it sound like it's a binary, right? But it should not be, because there are people that are clearly moving in both spaces, like Carmen Jimenez Smith. Her work, you can't separate identity from language. It's very much embedded. Or even, right, they've been doing this work all along. But as long as the conversation is not dismissing certain aesthetics, that's fine. If we all come together collectively and we're like, hey, you know what, we are all Latino, but not all of us are necessarily engaging these topics, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Should be helping each other out.
You may have noticed recently the Pulitzer Prizes seem to be a bonanza for African American to him, jazz poetry,
Right.
Gerge Parlow poetry, Colson Whitehead fiction, Hilton Ailes criticism, Lynn Nottage theater.
It's nice.
What's it going to take for there to be some future when our community does that?
I know. You have to tread very carefully, right?
Yeah.
Because in many ways, I feel that the Pulitzer Committee is finally catching up to the importance of African American writers. Right? African American writers, there's such an important group. They've taught many of us, they've mentored us on the page, but it still keeps the race conversation to black and white. They're ready from their perspective, but the establishment, when they look at race and when they see race and when they think, oh, we got to address racial flaws, they look at African Americans. It's not that it's easy, but it's the quickest solution in some ways, without diminishing the importance, because I read
Sure.
Julio. It's a brilliant book. And Lynn Nottage is a brilliant dramaturg.
Yeah.
Colson Whitehead, that guy's brilliant. So these are deserved awards. But at the same time, I feel like, wow, they've done their job. Can we talk about how even the National Book Award rarely looks at Asian American writers? You go through the list of finalists in the last couple of years, where are the Asian American writers? You'll see a Latino writer in there, or even Native American writers. So other groups also have been excluded.
Yeah.
The Poet Laureate of the United States, you finally had a Latino, but it was established by an Asian American diplomat, but we never had an Asian American
Poet Laureate.
Poet Laureate. So there's ways in which there's arenas that really need attention. But in terms of when the Pulitzer Committee is going to recognize the Latino community, one way is we have to get judges on there.
Yeah.
The judges are important gatekeepers. They help curate the finalists. That's it. There's one reason that I've always accepted being a judge and the jury for many different awards. I never say no, because I'm afraid that if I say no, they're going to be like, we tried inviting Latinos and they said no. It's just me.
Yeah.
You know? I think I represent the entire community. So it's important for us to be in there, which is why I joined the National Book Critic Circle for many years, 8 years, which is why I'm now on the board of trustees of AWP. So we can help guide the decision-making process from the inside. You know, it's something that I learned very early on, that I come from a family of activists, and their activism had to be on the outside because they were not on the inside. So my family, they went on marches, they did strikes, and always from the outside, get the signs, get the flags, and you yell, and that from the outside, right? But the solution really had to come from the inside somehow. But they had to do that to demonstrate publicly, right? Sometimes I see people trying to call out the Pilsner Committee, the National Book Award Foundation, or AWP from the outside. And I think we're not in an era and we're not in a moment where we don't have access to the inside if you work, if you get in there. So that's why I don't necessarily join those kind of fights. Because I think, screaming and yelling and shaking our fists at the wall is only going to get us to a certain moment. Just
Getting a seat at the table and trying to affect change.
of course. And that comes with compromises too. So many times I've been called a sellout, even though my politics is I'm very open and transparent about what I believe in. But even then, because I'm on the inside, I'm a vendido, I'm a sellout. And I've been called that by people. And I'm like, whatever, I can't do anything about that.
When you look at what you've accomplished up until now, I know you got the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Publishing Triangle. And you look at, say, the next 10 years, what's the big picture for you in terms of the next thing you want to accomplish?
The next thing I want to do is make sure that there are young people that continue this fight and this fire to participate, to get inside these organizations, to be mentors, to be book reviewers, to be book critics. Once I burn out, once I retire or something happens to me, somebody needs to fill that void. And I would like to stop doing that because I'm getting very tired. I'm getting exhausted. I've been there for a long time now. And now I understand my mentors before would be like, why are they doing anything? Like I did it for 30, 40 years. So I feel the same way now. I'm reaching that stage and I want to see young people step in and take over some of these things that I'm doing because if not, then that's the end. We're going to start from scratch.
So do you envision some kind of initiative or mechanism by which we try to help?
Absolutely. I'm going to be at the Canto Mundo retreat and I've already talked to the folks there. And I said, one thing I want to talk about is I would be more than willing to mentor some young writers, opening up some avenues for them to publish their work. Book reviews, yes, to understand. I'm not going to help them publish their poems. Other people can do that. For me, look, we need book critics. We need those people that are going to join the conversation. And book reviewing is tough. Writers feel they're compromising their time, shining the light on someone else.
Yeah.
Nobody seems to understand that when you shine the light on another writer, you also shine the light on yourself. And that you're not doing this for yourself. You're doing this for the community. But I want to tap into those that have that passion. That's something you can't just give it.
Yeah.
You awaken it. That's what I want to tap into. I want to speak to these people. And if nobody does it, you know what? I did my part. I tried. That's enough. But I think they're out there.
On that note, in surveying the landscape, who are some of the people that you've noticed in the last 10 years, 5 years, who you think are doing that good work? The generation behind us. Who's working on behalf of others, beginning to take their cue from people like yourself?
I think maybe this young man from Florida, Mario Ariza, who's actually very learned, and I'm trying to get him in there to write book reviews. I met him when I was down in Florida, and I think he's a Canto Mundo fellow.
What's his name?
Mario Alejandro Ariza, I think.
Okay.
And then there's even the Undocu poets.
Christopher Soto.
Javier Zamora, Christopher Soto, and Marcelo Gomez Castillo. That surprised me. That was amazing. This is something that I hadn't even thought about, right? Because it wasn't affecting me.
Yeah.
They identified the issue, the problem, and the complication, and they found a solution. It was amazing what they did. That I'm very excited about. Young women, I'm trying to think of a couple that I've run into. I don't think of any off the top of my head. There's a couple of young women that are doing this project down in Texas. It's like, but it's bilingual.
Yeah.
Because they invited me to be one of their keynotes.
Okay.
And last year's keynote was Juan Felipe.
Oh, okay.
They also invite Latin American writers. That's exciting to see. These things are happening.
One thing we haven't touched upon, and we've talked about it in the past, and I know it's on the horizon for Letras Latinas. We want to do the Andres Montoya Symposium. You were slated to be a participant in the launch for In the Grove a few years ago in Fresno. Talk a little bit about Andres Montoya.
Andres Montoya was one of the first writers that I felt a kinship. Because his book came out a few seconds before mine. Everybody's going to Charles. I didn't know that. I kept hearing a little buzz about the book, and I got the book, and I had no idea that he had passed away because I was all excited thinking, I got to write this guy and everything. And I found out he had passed away. The book was published posthumously and it blew me away. It has so many of the elements that I knew were important to somebody who was in a moment of a spiritual exploration crisis. and healing. I thought this is exactly the kind of journey I'm on through very different elements, but and just linguistically quite beautiful, quite beautiful. So I thought the book needs to be celebrated, needs to be written, needs to be read about, needs to be discussed. So I know that he's got a huge sort of following and community that still keeps his work alive.
Yeah, I know that when Francisco Aragón passed away, and then thinking more recently about Andres Montoya and his new book, Joy of Trees, I view them as that are accessible and deserve a much wider audience outside our community than they have. They're really well known within the Chicano Latinx community, both Francisco and Andres, but
Not outside of it.
that profile that was written in the New Yorker about that young poet who died, and then John shared the little supplement of his poetry in Poetry Magazine. I feel like Andres Montoya is in that category. I think we have poets who could easily have much wider audiences and are accessible, but don't.
I don't want to speak ill of the dead. I don't want to say about that particular author, but I will say that when you're connected to certain resources, you can do things like that. This is not the first time it's happened. We had some young, white, promising poets that die tragically or commit suicide, and then their book is being celebrated all over the place. We have that too in our communities, but we don't have the platforms to do that with. It's a weird kind of fetishizing of the tragic dead. And it'll still get me in trouble. I just don't like it. I don't like it because then you read the work and I'm like, are we allowed to say that it's terrible? Because the person's just died? You're not allowed to do that, right? And the thing is that we understand that we have, but also acknowledging too that some of those poets that did die young were very good.
Yeah.
I want to say that. But there's this weird sense of, oh my God, this person just died, they didn't have a chance. And they're mediocre. I don't think they would have had a chance anyways. But we identify, we also celebrate our dead. We also mourn our dead. But we don't have those kind of platforms to get on the New Yorker or Poetry Magazine. And I haven't read that young man. It's not about that young man because I haven't read his work, so I don't know. But again, it left a little bitter taste in my mouth where I thought, if we had access to it, we could have done this with El Montoya. Who knows? We'll see.
Okay, this has been a great conversation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.